Week 18 is in the books. We know exactly how the NFL playoffs are going to set up here from this point forth. We don't know the outcomes. We know all the seedings and the 14 teams that have made it in. So it's going to be an exciting couple of weeks here as we head towards the Super Bowl to see who can win it all. But Week 18 had some very entertaining moments, some heartbreaking moments, Shawn, for me. No, and it didn't even feel like heartbreak. It felt like the inevitable had just found its way back to fruition. I joked with the Packers. I was all the way out when they were on their losing streak. I thought, yeah, the season is done and dusted. I'll not get my hopes up moving forward. Then they get back to this Week 18 win and end scenario versus the Detroit Lions in a situation then where, because the Seahawks had won, the Lions could just play spoiler. But the Packers, they were spoiled by the Detroit Lions in this one. And, we've talked a lot about the Lions. I know Shawn is a Lions fan, and I think the Lions were just a better team on the night. So we're going to start off with that one. Shawn, we don't want to get off on the sad side of things with me moping about the Green Bay Packers. So let's give me it. What is the positive takeaway here for the Detroit Lions, even though it doesn't get them into the playoffs? A fantastic season as a whole, I think we have to look back on, and especially based on where they were at the mid-season point and how they fought back for their head coach, Dan Campbell, and what it means moving forward here. And a game where we like Jameson Williams, Shawn, and during the game I was grateful that this play was called back, but Jameson Williams has a deep touchdown completion and rush to the end zone in this one as well. So a little bright spot there for 2023.
Yeah, he looks like he looked in college, which is somebody you can't stay with. He had the score. It obviously got called back. They also had an interception, got called back. Both of those plays were, those are probably the two biggest plays in the game for the Lions. They lose both of them. They're both the correct call. The thing that you are lamenting as a Lions fan is that they're the correct call, and they might not have really impacted the play. Although the holding that wiped out Williams' touchdown was one of the most flagrant holdings you'll ever see. It's kind of a question of, is it in fact something that influenced the play? You have some of these plays where there's a very legitimate penalty, and yet at the same time, it's still a positive note for the team, or could have been a big play. The fact that he's able to do that. He has another play a little bit later where he easily beats the safety deep for a touchdown, and Jared Goff throws the ball away underneath, and he's frustrated. Now, when you basically haven't caught any NFL passes yet, you want to keep that frustration a little more to yourself. But he was wide open for a touchdown on that play. He's someone who looks like, and then later in the game, his one target that counts as an official target in the game book, he drops. And so, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. But if Goff can find him, and the one thing that we still are kind of questioning here with Goff is, can he unlock these guys as actual stars? What we watched with Amon-Ra St. Brown is that this sort of intermediate underneath threat, he can hit. And Amon-Ra was limited again in this game. Amon-Ra, a little bit of a slow finish. It'll be interesting to see how much that impacts his offseason price, especially when you consider that Jameson Williams is going to be a big factor in next year's offense. So now you're kind of looking at this, not in an identical way, but you're going to have a little bit of the same element that you have with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. How much can they both score? How high-powered does the offense actually have to be? The thing that you have with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. The thing that you have with A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. Now, one of the things that this year proved is that both guys can score. I don't think that was necessarily the question. It's a matter of how much are you willing to pay, and especially in the situation with the Lions, how much are you willing to pay with Jared Goff? He had a fantastic season. So many of the numbers support that. We talked on the show last week about how they're high scoring, and he's limited both sacks and interceptions. Those are really the three things, right? The fourth thing would still be kind of that big play, carry your team, as opposed to have the team somewhat carry you dynamic, and being able to make that deep throw would be part of it. Jameson Williams was open for a 50-yard touchdown earlier this season. Wide open. And Goff underthrows it by 3 or 4 yards, barely allowing the defensive back to get back and get his hand in there. So you can only lose so many of those in the course of a season without it really impacting what you do, especially if what you do is you're a dynamic deep threat. But this game was encouraging for the Lions. We got to see, Jamal Williams has not been the player that we're rooting for in that backfield, but he shredded the Packers in this game. We got to see DeAndre Swift make a couple of big plays. we got to see this crazy play call at the end.
He broke Barry Sanders' single season rushing touchdowns record for the Detroit
Which is
Lions.
gross. That's gross. I mean,
and that play at the end as well. Yeah, obviously I didn't want to see it as a Packers fan, but takes guts to call it. And the Lions are here to have some fun. They had a couple of plays during the game. That one that was called back for the holding penalty actually on that touchdown was kind of not quite a flea flicker, but a play of similar designs where the running back throws it back to the quarterback and it goes deep. So the Lions were there to have some fun in this one and continue to go for it in fourth down and pretty much continue to get rewarded for going on it. Keep trying to push forward.
They did. And on the other side of the ball, Christian Watson just absolutely electric. Obviously, there are going to be questions now about what the quarterback situation is here. Aaron Rodgers didn't really play that strong of a game outside of a few of these passes to Watson. But Watson, he goes for 5 and 104 in a game where, it didn't even really feel like he did that much. He has a 45-yard reception. But again,
spectacular as well. That 45-yard reception, spectacular.
He could easily have multiple 200-yard games next year. He looks unbelievable. The flip side of that, Romeo Doubs, 2 targets. The first one, another one of these where he and Aaron Rodgers are just not quite there. It is a key play to extend a drive. Aaron Rodgers throws it at his knees. You want that pass to be on the receiver. If it's not, you want the receiver to make the catch. Both of the guys have to do a little bit better there. Then later he has a potentially longer play, just a gorgeous pass, probably Aaron Rodgers' best pass of the night. The angles that they showed, it wasn't clear if the defensive back had perhaps grazed it and that led to the miss. But if you're a Packers fan, if you're a Doubs fan, those 2 plays, pretty heartbreaking. We got another game here where, you could argue that they ran the ball too much, but basically, you've got to score more than 16 points against the Detroit Lions. You got to throw more than 27 times. You got to play with some urgency. This is a good Packers team, and this is a big win for the Lions on the road. The Packers just never fully embraced being this dynamic Super Bowl caliber team, really, under this coaching staff and with Aaron Rodgers at the end of his career. I think you want to put a little bit more of your stamp on this game, do the kinds of things that we're seeing with the Chiefs and the Bills and the Bengals. The argument would just be the Packers aren't quite that good. But as a rising team with Aaron Rodgers as your QB, in what you've done the past several years, where you're top seed in the NFC and then don't do it, you want to see. You're going to have some narrative, and there are just a handful of games really that we're talking about. But in that small handful of games where the Packers did not seize the day, you just want to see more from your head coach and from your franchise quarterback.
Yeah, I would agree. And this was a season that a lot of things didn't click in. And in the past seasons, obviously we had back-to-back 13-3 seasons there for the Packers where the expectation was to get to the Super Bowl, to win the Super Bowl. This year, it never really felt that way. It'll be interesting to see how they go moving forward with the way they've managed the salary cap to really leverage it for the last 2 seasons. And obviously that hasn't worked out and they may have to live with that for a little bit of time. But this was a game where last week they get the big win against the Vikings. Everything falls their way. The kick returns go their way. Fumbles fall their way. This one, we have Aaron Jones with a fumble just before halftime was a really tough one. And then obviously Rodgers had the interception late where he's trying to force that ball downfield. But I do think credit has to go here to the Lions defense. I know we touched on that on the preview show last week, Shawn, but Hutchinson as well as a number of the other players had big games here. And you mentioned then the kind of some of the trickery and some of the play that they went for. I mentioned the fourth downs. I think they came to play. Maybe that was a little bit of the freedom they had from not having the pressure of making it to the. I know they don't want this and they didn't want it at the time, but the pressure of winning into the playoffs, they played a little bit looser. But big win for the Lions, and it's really not great for Packers, but good for Detroit Lions fans and good for fans of the NFL as we see this offense, this team progressing, because they have had their down years, which we referenced in the last couple of shows as well, Shawn. So a big one here for them. I want to go, Shawn, to not playoff implications next, but I want to go to a game which baffled me beyond belief at a number of times. That was the Texans and the Colts. We have a situation here where the Houston Texans get a win, 32-31, in the shootout of the weekend. And a game where throughout the game, Houston have a massive, I'm not big for the win percentages in terms of during the games for the win probability, but it's kind of, 89, 90, 91, into the fourth quarter. All of a sudden then it tails off, and we have a situation where it's 97.3 in favor of the Indianapolis Colts, and that is with 58 seconds left in the game. So as the game progressed in the fourth quarter, we have a situation where the Houston Texans get a win early, or they get up early. They have the number one seed before the game. If they win, they're going to lose that number one seed to the Chicago Bears, who lost to the Minnesota Vikings. The Colts get back into it in the second half in a situation where you think, yeah, maybe the Texans are going to sit back here a little bit. But on that drive to take the lead, Shawn, they have a 4th and 12 that goes to Brandon Cooks for 30 yards. And the play to get them ahead in this game is a 4th and 20 from the Indianapolis 28, which goes through the defensive back's hands to the tight end for a touchdown. Then they go for a 2-point conversion. They complete the 2-point conversion to win the game. There's 50 seconds left, but the Colts do not get the job done there. Then after this, Lovie Smith is out of a job with the Houston Texans, and it feels like they may have had a conversation during the week that, Lovie, you're not going to be back next season. And he kind of felt like, well, I'm going to show you, I'm going to take this number one overall pick away from you. So how did you feel? How did you feel as this unfolded, Shawn? This was baffling to me. And as a result, the Bears now have the 101, and I'm sure there'll be question marks around what they're going to do with it, and with Justin Fields being the quarterback and so on moving forward. But just a bizarre turn of events here in week 18.
It really is. And all the way through, obviously, you expect that the Texans are thinking, in terms of that final drive, that they're not going to win. And, what's the harm in playing fast and loose, throwing the ball up there, seeing what happens? I mean, in the end, the harm is obviously that now you've lost the leverage on this top pick. And that could be extremely detrimental. We've seen how 1 versus 2
that can be franchise defining. That could set like the 1 versus the 2, the leverage that it gives you for what you may be able to do in terms of picks that you get. We've seen recently where the Dolphins have done quite well out of some of these trades. With a few years ago, the 49ers traded up for Lance and gave up quite a haul. So the leverage is the main thing that you touched on there, is from pick 1 to pick 2. People are going to want to try and get to that top pick. And the other part of it is if you end up getting an extra first rounder or an extra couple of second rounders along with that can turn the franchise around in terms of being good in 2 to 3 years versus trying to be good in 10 years' time.
And all you have to do is look at Peyton Manning versus Ryan Leaf, look at Trevor Lawrence versus Zach Wilson. I mean, Zach Wilson obviously should not have gone number 2. And so partly what you're going to do if you have that second pick is don't blow it. But I mean, again, that's easier said than done. Now, this draft, I don't think at this moment has a clear top pick. And I think that sometimes when that's the case, it's easier to play these games in week 18 where you're not focusing on that as much. The strange thing is that after a season where we heard that the quarterbacks are awful, and then obviously in week 18, you get pretty strong performances from Desmond Ridder and Sam Howell, it would not be surprising if it still turns out that those guys, and especially Howell, are similar caliber quarterbacks to the guys who go in the top 10 picks this year. There are players who are arguably less proven who are in the mix, according to some of the draft pundits. There are probably 2 guys who are at the top for fantasy, but even then, if you look at reality mocks, it's not clear that those will be the 2 guys who go. I think that they will be. I mean, I think when it all works itself out, that it's going to be those 2 players. And it may be that the Texans prefer the player who is in the second spot. But when you have the overall number 1 pick, you don't have to worry about that. You can trade down if it makes sense, if you're targeting actually the 3rd guy for some reason. And the 3rd guy sometimes turns out to be the guy. It's not like it's always the top players. I mean, you think about Patrick Mahomes, you think about Deshaun Watson. Obviously, they were not the top drafted quarterback in that particular draft, went more in a range where you could have moved down and made that selection. They're still going to be fine from that point. I mean, you can move down from number 2, but I mean, you lose an absolute ton by not having that pick. And I mean, it's interesting here because You know that the Colts are also in a situation where they have incentive to lose the game. To have a late game dynamic play out this way where both teams have incentive to lose and yet they're both frantically trying for the victory to the point where you get the 2-point conversion at the end. I mean, you could argue that going for 2 at the end is the best way to lose the game, but obviously they executed it. So that part of it is nice to see. It's nice to see two teams where their incentive is to lose, fight for it when you have some of these teams that are in the middle or even in the playoffs tanking the game. That part removes a little bit of the enjoyment. But Colm, we had a variety of games here where a team that had nothing to gain played a team that needed to win down the stretch. You have the game with the Jaguars and the Titans where the Jaguars are going to be heavy favorites there at home and with the Titans starting Joshua Dobbs. And yet the Titans had that game. If not for a fluky play at the end, they would have won and advanced. The Jaguars would be looking forward to another season. But the one that, as a Lions fan, and we talked about this obviously on the previous show, but that Rams-Seahawks game, the Lions deserved to be in the playoffs. The Lions were playing the best of these teams at the end, and we've talked about the officiating on several occasions this year, Colin. We don't want to make it a deal where every time that what we want to have happen doesn't happen, that we're frustrated. But the end of the Seahawks game was bizarre because you have the Rams called for a phantom running into the kicker penalty that extended the key drive for the Seahawks. And then you have two flagrant, and we're not talking about like borderline types of things. We're talking about two flagrant unsportsmanlike conduct penalties that were not called on the Seahawks, both of which dramatically influenced field position at a critical moment in the game. The officials get bailed out the first time because Myers misses the kick. The second time, they do not. This is when I was kind of joking with friends as I was going along. We've all had that situation where you're playing college intramurals and the team you're playing against is having the game officiated by their buddies. And you're like, well, I mean, things aren't going to go our way in this particular contest. You don't want NFL games to feel like they're being officiated by Seahawks fans. The other part of this is that a big congratulations to Geno Smith. He didn't play a great game, but he competed all the way down to the end. Congratulations, I guess, to the Seahawks organization for having the foresight to move Russell Wilson. We thought that was a great trade, even though we didn't think it was going to work out remotely to this extent for them. But I was baffled at how undisciplined this team is. I mean, the number of things that they did to try and lose this game, where the players just simply seem to care way more about themselves than about the team actually winning. There are good and bad things about Pete Carroll's style, and you want your players to play loose. You want them to play aggressively. You want them to have fun. You want them to feel empowered to make some of their own decisions and to go out there and be their true version of themselves. And yet a little bit of composure, a little bit less selfishness. And the Seahawks wouldn't have had to deal with some of these questions about how the officials gifted them this victory.
Yeah, and that kind of takes me to the next team. So we'll try and link some of this into the playoff-related stuff. But they now, because of the result in the Packers game, which you talked about earlier, they face off against the number 2 seed, which is the San Francisco 49ers in San Francisco. The 49ers this week win 38-13 against the Cardinals. As we record this, the news coming out that Cliff Kingsbury has been relieved of his duties in Arizona. So we'll see what happens with their coaching staff over the coming weeks and months. But Shawn, this game starts off with your guy, AJ Green, with a 77-yard touchdown. I didn't know what year we were watching. I didn't know if it was a highlight clip. I didn't know what was going on. But after that, the 49ers kind of said, well, that's enough of that. And they decided to romp straight through this. The question I have for you is there a chance that we see the Seahawks upset the 49ers and move through here? I think it's very hard to see that. Another game here as well for Brock Purdy. 15-20, 178 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. He continues to look fantastic. And his starts, they have gone 6-0. And I know that's not down to him specifically, but when you have Christian McCaffrey, when you have Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, and they do get Deebo Samuel back in this game, I just think the 49ers are in perfect position. So the two questions are, can the 49ers lose to the Seahawks? Can the Seahawks beat the 49ers? And then can Brock Purdy lead this 49ers team to a Super Bowl victory this year? Because we have been in on the 49ers, but each week they continue to look better and better. Yeah, the answer to both of those questions is obviously yes. The likelihood
of them dropping a game to the Seahawks is pretty low. But one of the things that this weekend again reiterated is that these NFL teams are relatively close in talent. The quarterback situation obviously is going to play a huge role. Can Brock Purdy continue the miracle run? I mean, I think we've seen enough to know that he is a solid rookie QB. And one of the questions here would be, if it weren't for this story where he's Mr. Irrelevant and he's coming in as the third stringer and everything feels somewhat miraculous, then he'd be dealing with different questions of, okay, well, you're a rookie who's been good. Can you keep it up? Can you do it in the playoffs? Yeah. And that part in and of itself would be tough. But one of the things that is an interesting contrast, I mean, the games that you tend to think of this week as being a little bit surprising, you have Dolphins-Jets, where maybe with the Dolphins QB situation and the collapse that they're undergoing, you're expecting the Jets with Joe Flacco, who probably is a mild upgrade on their other options. The Jets have that elite defense. They've got some interesting offensive weapons, probably expecting them to win that game, or at least for the game to be a little bit more interesting. Obviously expecting the Jaguars to win without so much luck at the end against the Titans. You're expecting the Seahawks to win much more easily against the Rams. All of those games kind of reiterating that, I mean, these are going to be tough contests in many situations. Not all. Obviously, the 49ers hammer the Cardinals. What I like to do is think back a week to where they almost lose to the Las Vegas Raiders, with Jarrett Stidham making his first NFL start. And you're thinking, well, I mean, the Raiders are actually a pretty good team. Stidham played well. I mean, the Raiders are kind of this opposite side of the Vikings where they're losing all of their close games. So sort of the flip of the story just specifically for the Raiders last year, where the Raiders won a bunch of close games, make the playoffs. They come back this year, do the opposite. But, I mean, are they that different of a team? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, Josh is probably not the coach you want to maximize the quality of your personnel. So they could be a weaker team, even with getting Devontae Adams into the mix there. And yet, the Raiders, pretty good, but they get annihilated by the Kansas City Chiefs after the Chiefs have been on this run where you're asking yourself, I mean, is it even a given that they're going to win that game and clinch this controversial number one seed that they have now? Again, week to week, you're going to get some widely varying results in the NFL. I think that if the Seahawks pass defense plays as well as it has recently, if Geno Smith can have one of his best games, if you can get DK Metcalf to get out there and make an impact, I mean, he's really gone away over the last month. They need a lot more from him than just, trying to commit unnecessary unsportsmanlike conduct penalties. I mean, when you're like working at it, and the officials are like, we're going to look the other way. And you're like, well, then I haven't accomplished my objective yet. I'm going to get back there on the field and try and you want to see him make some plays as opposed to fight with the guys defending him. If he can do that, it can be a close game. But this 49ers team looks absolutely amazing to the extent where we have Elijah Mitchell gets in there for 5 carries and scores 2 touchdowns. They now have that 1-2 punch again at running back. Obviously, they've got the 3 stars in the passing game. George Kittle, I mean, it's not on huge volume necessarily, but he looks like the run after catch threat that he's been multiple seasons ago. He looks unstoppable in the red zone. I mean, this 49ers team has to be really co-favorites in the NFC with the Philadelphia Eagles, even though they have to play that extra game because the extra game is against the Seahawks. I mean, again, we didn't think that the Jaguars were going to have so much trouble in their somewhat straightforward game. I mean, you could lose that game. That's one of the reasons why the bye is so important. But I think you have to love the 49ers. And we've been drafting them a lot in Underdog drafts column. We're going to have more content on Underdog playoffs. We're going to have content on FFPC playoffs. 2 very unique and very different contests. And I love the kind of mental gymnastics and the puzzle that each of them represents. Those will be shows that we do later in the week.
Shawn, moving into a little bit of a rapid reactions or a rapid recap, I guess we'll say the Eagles obviously will get that bye in the NFC. They have the positive news this week that Jalen Hurts comes back in. Didn't have a great game, but the positive is that he is back out there, has the time to recover now. We'll see how they do post-bye week. They beat the Giants 22-16, and not a huge amount else going on there. A game, Shawn, where it had huge playoff implications. Not a huge amount going on in this game either, though. It was the Dolphins 11, the Jets 6. I mentioned to you before recording the show, Shawn, this was a tough watch. We get Joe Flacco with 149 passing yards. We get Skylar Thompson with 152. And a real difficult watch. If you're looking to load something up on your Game Pass, or you have all the games recorded, do not select this game unless you are a Dolphins fan really wanting to see them win this one. Garrett Wilson, though, does get 17 targets for 9 receptions, 89 yards. Outside of that, nothing really happening at all on the Jets side. So we'll see how the Dolphins do in the playoffs, but with Skylar Thompson, if he is the quarterback moving forward in these potential games, they're not going to go anywhere really going forward. Another game, though, Shawn, that had huge playoff, or no playoff, let me do that again. Another game, Shawn, that had no playoff implications was the Commanders and the Cowboys. The Cowboys playing quite a few of their starters in this one. We have Dak Prescott with 37 pass attempts. The Cowboys look really, really bad in this one. 14 completions for Dak Prescott. Out of those 37 attempts, 128 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. They struggled mightily throughout this. And the news, I guess, Shawn, I want to get your opinion on the opposite side is kind of how do the Cowboys bounce back in the playoffs? I think that probably should be pretty straightforward for them to get, a better performance than what they had here, but it is very concerning. But on the other side, we do get Sam Howell. He comes in, his first pass attempt in the NFL as a touchdown to Terry McLaurin. He goes 11 of 19, 169 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He also has 5 rush attempts for 35 yards and a touchdown from him. Terry McLaurin, 74 and 1 touchdown off 3 receptions. The Cowboys were atrocious here. I think this is tape they won't want to watch back. But any thoughts on Sam Howell, who I think even with the limitations that he had in this game, is still a better option than Carson Wentz here for the Commanders?
Yeah, I don't understand why Washington more or less tanked the end of their season, because the very obviously,
they had a won last week, they would be in the playoffs ahead of the Seahawks and the Packers and all that talk.
I mean, it's utterly bizarre because Howell did everything that we expected him to do. He did have the one, big rookie mistake where he throws a bad interception in the end zone. And that could have changed this game pretty dramatically if the Cowboys had participated at any point. And yet, I mean, he averages just under 9 yards per attempt, despite the fact that Jahan Dotson just flagrantly dropped a beautifully thrown long pass that would have given him another 40, 50 yards. And he comes back, he hits Dotson on a long play, he hits McLaurin. I mean, both of those guys have a 30-plus yard completion in this one. I mean, they don't have a ton of receptions, but they both go over 70 yards because of the vertical nature of both the players and Howell. Right? He's throwing beautiful deep balls throughout this game. He's also put in a difficult situation because they're going run, pass, run, pass, run, pass. So he's being forced to try and pick up these third downs to keep drives alive. And he does it magnificently. You see the legs. He rushes 5 times for 35 yards and a touchdown. He's both able to extend drives and he gets the red zone score. I mean, he's not going to be a Justin Fields. He's not going to be a Lamar Jackson. But he can be somebody who is, I don't know if it's even necessarily a poor man's version of Jalen Hurts. I mean, the similarities between these two guys are extreme in that he's got the athleticism. He's going to be able to get some of these rushing yards that are more or less out there for the taking for mobile quarterbacks, especially if you have receivers that can threaten down the field. He's got his McLaurin and Dotson, as obviously Hurts has Brown and Devontae Smith. And he's got that big arm. He's got the vertical accuracy. Those are the 2 components that you really want to see from a quarterback in the contemporary NFL. I mean, you talk about, what are the weaknesses here? Is he going to be able to execute a true NFL offense the way the coaches want? He's not extremely tall. And yet, it really distracts you from thinking about what's working now. What do offenses need in the current landscape versus things they might have needed 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? It doesn't mean he's necessarily going to succeed. It doesn't necessarily mean he's even going to get that many more career starts. We don't know what the future holds for him from that perspective. And yet he's the perfect quarterback in terms of the template that is successful now in the NFL. He showed a lot of composure on a variety of these passes. You just hope that he gets a real chance either with the Commanders or somewhere else. Again, it's hard to see how he could have had a more perfect initial game. On the other side of that, when the Cowboys don't do anything, Dak Prescott looks awful in a variety of ways. The Commanders are able to wipe out both Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott, who carries 8 times for 10 yards. They're able to limit CeeDee Lamb, who does still catch a touchdown, but the rest of these guys don't factor into the game at all. The Cowboys are a little bit of a mystery to me, Colm, because every time that I really focus on them, they look awful. And we know coming into the game, they've been hot. They've been one of the highest scoring teams in the NFL. You've got Tony Pollard having a magical season. You have CeeDee Lamb establishing himself in that top echelon of wide receivers. I think you're going to have them come out and look very different in the playoffs against Tampa Bay. But when you think about the possibilities for playoff contests, it's not a no-brainer that they win. Guys like Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are very interesting on the Tampa Bay side of it. And I think that this game injects more uncertainty, especially because the Tampa Bay players are fun fantasy options. And because Tom Brady is on the other side of that, the Cowboys are probably the best sort of sleeper team, or more accurately, probably contrarian team as you play these different playoff contests. And yet, if you've been kind of emphasizing them as a contrarian play over the last 2 or 3 weeks, this game is very disconcerting.
Yeah, it wasn't good. There wasn't a lot getting going, but we'll see what happens. But you mentioned the Buccaneers. Buccaneers kind of played a little bit of this game, took their players out, rested them. Smart decision from their side. We have Tom Brady just threw 17 passes. I thought Desmond Ridder looked good this week, threw it 30 times, 19 completions, 224 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. Tyler Algier continues to look very good, 24 attempts, 135 yards on the ground for him, a long of 28. And then Drake London had 8 targets, 6 receptions, 120 yards. So it may just be what's happening at the end of the season, but we are seeing flashes from Drake London, which we would hope to see continue to progress into the 2023 season. Shawn, I mentioned their teams, kind of playing smart, taking their starters out. The Cowboys didn't do that quite late. The other team that didn't do it quite late was the Chargers. They were locked into their seeding, hadn't really anything to play for. They lose then, and they end up to the Denver Broncos in a game which Mike Williams picks up an injury, Joey Bosa picks up an injury. We'll see what happens with the news coming out on them, but Keenan Allen gets 2 touchdowns, 100 yards, 8 receptions in this one. But what are we doing at this point? We kind of talked about the other side of things with how the Texans finished their game, but what was your thoughts here on watching how the Chargers played this out and then kind of going as bad as they could with them picking up a loss and also picking up some injuries that could be key because they play on Saturday this week as well?
Yeah, that's a tough one. This wasn't the game that I was that focused on because there were more interesting ones going on at the same time, and I haven't caught up on everything from this one. And yet, as I was watching that Cowboys game, as soon as it became clear that, and you could argue that these things happen pretty close in time to each other, but as soon as it becomes clear that the Eagles are going to win, then you want to pull your guys from that game, especially as they're getting humiliated by the Commanders. Once you have that Bengals-Ravens result and it no longer matters for the Chargers, it's tough because especially someone like a Mike Williams, you could argue, needs some practice in a game situation with Justin Herbert there to, not necessarily to build the rapport. These guys have been together for a long time, but he has not had the dynamic season, even when healthy, that people were hoping for from him this year, for them to be a true Super Bowl contender. And we talk a little bit about the Cowboys as being the perfect contrarian pick on the NFC side and how Sunday's performance, raises questions about, if you even want to go that route for your contrarian plays. The Chargers were probably that team on the AFC side, and especially after you watch the Jaguars look really, I mean, they were just so disappointing against the Titans. You consider the Titans' pass defense has struggled so much over the last month and a half, and Trevor Lawrence, who had been on fire, not able to carry his team to the playoffs. Instead, they get the strip sack and the scoop and score that allows them to get there. He's then going to go into the playoffs. Maybe you're looser actually in the playoffs than playing to get into the playoffs. But coming off of that bad game, this situation here, Jaguars-Chargers, those are the guys that you're looking to target one side of that game or the other on your different teams. The right picks there could either create the leverage for you or simply could create the advancement for you that allows you to do what you want later, even though people are not really expecting the Jaguars or the Chargers to factor into the conference title game. But the team that wins in the first round is then going to get points in the second round in a potentially high-scoring game. And so from that perspective, I mean, these were the teams you're looking at. Now both the Jaguars and the Chargers, similar to the Cowboys, have raised enough questions. Now, partly we know, again, that the NFL is going to fluctuate very wildly week to week in terms of some of these results. And the people who are the most successful in fantasy are able to manage those swings and to kind of bet in the opposite direction, especially when the underlying trends are still positive. And so, I mean, I'm still very much looking forward to Jaguars Chargers, but I'm sure the Chargers are questioning some of their decisions as they wake up on Monday.
Yeah, certainly. And on that Chargers game, on the positive side, Latavius Murray was somebody who surprised me a lot this season. He goes 15 for 103 and 1 touchdown. So he's had a really nice career in the NFL. I guess that's what we'll leave it at, because but he's had a fantastic run this season, I have to say. Obviously, we hope Javonte Williams is back for 2023, but I do think there's a strong chance that he is with the Denver Broncos as the second option there. Jerry Jeudy, 154 yards and 5 receptions for him. Another nice kind of end of the season from what has been a difficult year for him and the Broncos, and Russell Wilson throwing 3 touchdowns in this one. Shawn, the final game to touch on is the Bills and the Patriots, and obviously there was a situation for the Patriots to get in, but they do not win this game, and Naheem Hines, who is a trade deadline acquisition for the Buffalo Bills, has 2 return touchdowns in this. Looks electric on those plays, and the first play of the game actually being one of those returns. And obviously with everything that happened with Buffalo and DeMar Hamlin over the last week, the Bills come out here, they get the win 13-3 to finish out the season. Stephon Diggs has 7 for 104 and a touchdown, a really nice touchdown grab. Shawn, one of the most exciting things I was about all weekend was seeing John Brown get in the end zone. Smokey Brown was back, 1 for 42 and a touchdown on 1 target for John Brown as well in this Buffalo game. Any notes to take away from it outside of the Bills looking pretty good? A bad interception thrown by Josh Allen in this game, but he looked really good outside of that.
Yeah, this was the game where I thought that we could see a result more similar to some of the results that we actually did get, where teams you thought were going to win easily struggled. I thought that this was a great chance for the Patriots. Obviously, from a human perspective, I don't think it would have surprised any of us if the Bills were unsettled. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they would play poorly or they would be flat, but despite the fantastic news, and again, I mean, that's the best thing that's come out of the NFL in the last week is just the recovery of DeMar Hamlin. This is going to be a tough game for them. And you saw that on occasion, like, as you mentioned, the Josh Allen interception was about the worst pick you're going to ever see thrown by a superstar. I mean, these things happen in NFL games all the time, but you don't expect it to happen from a Josh Allen. And it was in the midst of this epic streak where he had not thrown an interception against the Patriots for some obscene number of consecutive passes, I think in the 190s. It ends on a bad pick, and yet in no way, shape, or form does he let that stop him. You mentioned Stephon Diggs. He goes 7-104, and 1 has that 49-yard touchdown. Diggs, an emotional player, playing big. There was that talk of, well, what is the Hines acquisition going to do for Cook or Singletary? And the main thing that we found is that those guys are going to continue to split work in a way that makes it difficult to play them regardless. But Hines is the guy that they want to help add another dimension to the team. I mean, good teams are constantly trying to add little pieces that could help at a moment where it makes all the difference. Right, this was the storybook beginning. He returns the opening kick for a touchdown. The Patriots come back and actually then do more or less control the first half. But when you're the weaker team, when you're the less explosive team, when you're playing a team like the Buffalo Bills, and you're going to need to be perfect, the last thing that can happen is to start the game by giving up that score. I did like Mac Jones' competitiveness. He throws 40 times. He throws the 3 touchdowns. You have a big game from Devontae Parker, Devontae Parker is, 6 or 7 years earlier in his sort of trajectory than AJ Green. Every time that you think, well, he has absolutely zero value, and you look at different dynasty waiver wires, and unless you have a deep league, Devontae Parker is going to be out there. And in this one, 6 receptions, 79 yards, 2 touchdowns. I think the most disappointing thing in this game is that with Parker back and very involved, you have Tyquan Thornton, who really seems like the future of this passing game. For him just to have the 2 targets, not necessarily even play a lot. Kendrick Bourne back and involved. You just don't want to see Parker and Bourne be the guys who have 12 of the targets here. Obviously, Hunter Henry 7, Jacoby Myers 7, Stevenson 6. A very balanced attack, but to not have Thornton, especially after last week, at least gave us some mildly positive glimpses. I think that is disappointing going into the offseason. Clearly, the thing that you're doing as a Patriots team is you're trying to win this game. You think you can win. You control your own destiny. So if you do win, you don't have to rely on somebody else. And yet, for it to go like this in the end, they fight back multiple times. They create a competitive game, but in the end, the Bills are just too good. And that's just the way this situation is for the Patriots right now, is the Bills are too good. Chiefs, Bills, Bengals. Those would still be my top 3 teams, even with how strong the Eagles and the 49ers look on that side. It's one of the reasons that the NFL's decisions about how they would play the playoffs on the AFC side so controversial, because you have 2 of the teams obviously involved in the game that gets canceled, and then you have the Chiefs benefiting, you have the Bengals really getting the short end of the stick. Hopefully, what we're going to see here is the AFC playoffs are going to be fantastic. The teams are going to have their chances. The Bengals have another shot here to write their version of the storybook finish by coming through this difficult run. The Bills will have their shot to ascend and become the power team in football. The Chiefs have a little bit of a chance at redemption after the last 4 years where they make it to 2 Super Bowls. They win 1. Obviously, they've got a clean path to get back. Colm, the playoffs are going to be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, even those 3 teams that you mentioned, you have the Bills who haven't got there yet. You mentioned the way that the Chiefs have won 1, lost 1. You have the Bengals who lost last year. So there's just so much. And the other thing about them is they're young quarterbacks on young teams who are ascending. You would still have to imagine, based on how they've been built, and even with the Chiefs, retooling with Tyreek Hill moving on and taking in the kind of combination of wide receivers. I think it's going to be really intriguing. Obviously, this weekend is always a fun weekend, but adding in the extra 2 teams, I think as well does, kind of lower the quality maybe of those final teams. But I think when we get to next weekend, I think it's going to be spectacular. But I'm excited for the playoffs of this week as well, to see how it all starts to filter out. And of course, with only 1 team from each conference on the bye, it makes it even more intriguing. Shawn, there was lots of storylines going into week 18 of the NFL season, but I think the biggest might have been sent to me on Twitter by Chandler Wagner. Chandler has sent in questions in the past, but this one was related to Pat Crane's BBM3 win. So again, we didn't talk about this. We talked about potentially winning it. We didn't talk about it at the end of last week. The last show we did was before the finalization of what was going to happen with some of these tournaments. So congratulations to Pat on his BBM3 win. But it was, maybe this is a big enough accomplishment to get Shawn to log into Twitter so he can hit that congratulatory tweet for Pat Crane. Now, this was sent 3 days ago, Shawn, and we have yet to see Shawn log into Twitter and send that tweet. So I'm assuming that that's going to be a no.
Well, it didn't occur to me until you mentioned to me right before the show here. Yeah, I mean, for me,
we're
Twitter
always wondering what is the big thing. What's the big thing?
Well, there's no big thing. That's the deal. There's no big thing. Last year, Colm, I mean, you and I were a play away from winning the best ball tournament. And I mean, if there were going to be a moment, that would have been the moment. But Yeah. Pat's accomplishment, unreal. I had a chance to send him a personal note, which obviously is personal. And again, not not the same as Twitter.
Is that not what you're meant to put on Twitter?
Well, no, you can. You can. I mean, there are so many good ways to use Twitter. And I think that
people just choose not to.
Well, but people choose to use it the right way too. Yeah. I mean, it's not being on there for me is not supposed to be an indictment of Twitter. It's a personal decision. And again, I mean, I'm not saying it's something that couldn't change in the future, but
it's not going to change in the future.
But yeah, I mean, it is emotional because to have watched Pat develop, and I say develop, I mean, Pat was brilliant from the beginning. And I mean, we still reference some of his earliest work because it's still relevant and awesome. Obviously, he's done lots of fantastic stuff in the interim. I've obviously tried to communicate to him how excited I am for him. I mean, everybody's excited for him because Pat's a cool guy. I mean, there are so many people. No, there aren't. I was going to say there are a lot of people where if they won, people would mostly be frustrated because they don't care for him. That's also not true. The vast majority of people out there are awesome. And if someone in the community won, we would have been excited for them in the way that we're excited for Pat. If one of our listeners had won, we would have been excited. If somebody else's listener had won, we would have been excited. I mean, it's a great story, regardless of how you look at it. But specifically with Pat, it's a great story because he's so good. And he's also one of the coolest people. We did really a pretty significant segment on that in our last Stealing Bananas. Again, because Ben and I also just absolutely love Pat. So, yeah, it's so cool. We wish, I mean, obviously everybody, and no one more than Pat himself, wish that it had happened in a different way. But very deserved, fantastic story. And not through Twitter, but through several other venues, I've made that point because it's a key point. Pat is the best.
Yeah, no, and you were mentioning that. I think to see such unilateral support for somebody winning is fantastic, and I think Pat is well deserving of both winning it and the support and the congratulations for doing so. So once again, shout out to him. The only pressure is now he has to try and repeat. You know, the guys over there at the FF Go Bills have put a lot of pressure onto people to repeat, and you know they're potentially talking about a three-peat if they can, you know, win again over at the FFPC. An amazing accomplishment from them as well. Shawn, that's going to do it for our first show of the week. You teased it earlier. We'll have some playoff contest-related content coming over the next few days, so make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get those shows once they are available. You can also sign up to RotoViz.com. You have two options now for discounts. The 1 month one will be running out shortly, but for 10% off a 1 month subscription, it is RV Radio 2022. For 10% off a 1 year subscription, it is RV Radio 2023 at checkout. Get you access to all of the content and tools up on RotoViz.com. So check that out. Until we are back, though, my name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. And of course, check out Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. He has mentioned that he won't be on Twitter over the foreseeable future. But until then, have a good one.